thank you everybody for joining us today for this Thrive webinar. And today we are looking at mental health, and we are very fortunate to have Anita Guru with us, and she is going to take us on a journey where we're going to discover more about mental health and infertility. The chat box is open. This is being recorded. You can get a recording sent to you later, so if you need to disappear, not a problem at all. Put any questions in the chat and we will get to them at the end, or at any point that Anita wants to engage with that. So let me just hand over now and say welcome, Anita.
Thank you, and thank you for the introduction. And yeah, welcome everybody. So glad you're able to make it. And as Chevy mentioned, I'll be talking about mental health and infertility and how the two come together. Okay, so just to kind of set the scene, so everyone is unique, and we come from different experiences, background, thoughts, and feelings. So it is very much talking about from my perspective and my experience, and obviously there's a lot more different perspectives out there. So I'll be taking you through that today. Just to create a safe space, and for you to take care of your own well-being. If you feel like you need to step away because you're feeling that the topic is resonating or bringing up emotions, then feel free to do so. You're absolutely fine to just listen into the conversation and take what you need from it. Just want to make sure that everyone's okay. And if you are having any issues, then if you just want to drop the message in the chat, Chesley's also online. And really this is for you to have a bit more understanding about the issue, and to just support you with your own well-being. So a little bit about me. So I'm Anita Guru. I'm a wellbeing and leadership development consultant, coach, and public speaker. And I go under the name of the Mind Guru. Sorry, that's meant to say the Mind Coach. My surname is Guru. So I myself have been on a personal journey with infertility, which is over 10 years, and also with mental illness, following an ectopic pregnancy, which I'll talk about a bit later on, which led to a complex PTSD diagnosis. So since then, I've been raising awareness around infertility, trying to open up the conversation in the workplace, because it is still a taboo. There is still a lot of stigma, and people will go through it alone. So it's really about trying to create those inclusive environments and giving people opportunity to actually share. So what is infertility? You might have heard the term, but what does it actually mean? So according to the World Health Organization, their definition is it's a disease of both male and female reproductive systems, which is defined by the failure to achieve a pregnancy after trying for 12 months. Now, there's millions of people around the world who are impacted, and it's approximately 1 in every 6 who are going through infertility, who are at the age where they would be going down that route and down that pathway. So there's a lot of people out there, but you might be seeing a bit more where people are talking about it, but there's a lot going on behind the scenes where people are not sharing. Now, I thought I'd touch a bit on what is IVF, because when you think about infertility, you typically think about the IVF journey. So what does this actually look like, and what does it mean? So it's quite a long process. And I think it's good to consider for anyone who's even got to the stage of going through a consultation or thinking about it, they've already been on a journey. So it could have been a year, could have been longer, of trying to conceive where it hasn't been successful. So you'll go for a consultation, you'll have some tests done, scans, blood work. And then once you're ready to get going, you'll start taking what everyone might be familiar with is injections. And it's hormone injections to stimulate the ovaries to create more eggs than what you would normally have going through your cycle. So, and then all the way through the process, you're coming in for scans, and they're checking that the eggs are maturing. And when they get to a certain size, that's when you decide, okay, it's time to go to egg retrieval. Now, this is where it's quite invasive. You go under a general anaesthetic, they'll go in and retrieve those eggs, and then they get assessed in terms of, okay, what is good quality, what looks like it could be a positive outcome. So then they'll go on to fertilize them with the sperm. So that could be done naturally, or through something called ICSI, where the kind of the tail is removed and it's actually injected into the egg. And then the embryo is developed typically over 5 days, and then you have an embryo transfer where one embryo of what looks like the top quality would be put back in. Now, a lot happened to get to this stage, and sounds like a lot, but I think from experience and from many others who would say the same, the 2-week wait of when you're waiting to see whether it's been successful is a real roller coaster. So within that time, you're thinking, you know, is it worked? Has it happened? And you feel like you've got symptoms and you question it. So it's a real roller coaster of emotions. And just going on that journey, lots of things can happen where, you know, perhaps the eggs aren't not maturing, or you don't retrieve good quality eggs, or even, you know, they don't get fertilized and progress to a stage where they can be transferred. So a lot of things can go wrong, and obviously a lot of things can go well. And I think it's also good to consider, so when it comes to funding, there is very limited funds. So with the NHS funding, it's actually a postcode lottery. So depending on where you live, you may or may not have any funding. And that funding, if it exists, could be for 1 round or it could be for 3 rounds. But it is very unfair, and there's a lot of campaigns going on to change that. But equally, self-funding for IVF is very expensive, and that can also add to, you know, the challenges and how it can impact your mental health. So thinking about this sort of journey, it is a lot of pressure, can create a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, because you don't actually have any control over how this is going to impact you or how it's going to progress. So that's something to consider. Now, every journey is unique. So going through the path of becoming a parent can look very different for each person. So just going to touch on a few things and where it kind of varies. So you've got things like secondary infertility. That's where you've managed to have a successful pregnancy and you have a child, and on trying to grow your family, it doesn't work. So that's classified as secondary infertility. The LGBTQ plus community have a very different experience. So they might be going through, you know, things like donor conception and also surrogacy in order to achieve their pregnancy, and they'll come across different challenges. You know, with donor conception and surrogacy, that's also different routes that people can take based on their circumstances. Adoption is a route that can play a part. And then something called IUI, which is where it kind of can be a bit of a step before IVF, where the sperm is actually injected into the woman to create a pregnancy. So it's not as invasive. And obviously you've got IVF. And the thing that underpins kind of a lot of this is childlessness, not by choice. So this is, you're on this path because you haven't been able to achieve something that you want out of life, and that can really have an impact on your mental health, where you feel like you don't have control. And just when you think about infertility, people generally think it's a woman thing. Absolutely not. It's equally a male issue and a female issue, if not sometimes, I think the stats are it's a bit more typically based on something to do with the male. And that could be anything, you know, it could be an underlying issue, health condition, but in 30 to 40% of cases, it's actually unexplained. So there isn't actually a reason why it's not happening. So that can also add to the stress of going through this whole journey. Now, thinking about the impact of infertility and being on that journey. So the Fertility Network conducted some research last year with Middlesex University, and they found that 83% felt sad, frustrated, and worried often or all the time. Now, that is, you know, a lot to be carrying, and it can definitely be that way, even if you're not going through treatment, or if you are going through treatment, it can really have an impact on you mentally, and low mood, and just having that real kind of anxiety about it. 47% experience feelings of depression often or all the time, which is, again, a very high rate and shows the real impact. And quite, alarmingly, 40% share that they experience suicidal feelings. So this gives you a bit of an idea of the actual weight and the impact of infertility and how it can really have effect on your mental health. And a lot of the time, what's a lot of people experience is isolation. They don't want to share what's going on. There's a lot of shame around it. So a lot of the time they're actually going through this alone. So that's a bit around survey findings, but in reality, how does it really feel? What is the experience of going on this journey? So grief, and this is a really good, I think, explanation. So struggling with infertility is like dealing with the 5 stages of grief every single month. So when you're leading up to it, when you're getting ready to try, and you get to the stage and you do that pregnancy test and it's not worked for you naturally, or even through treatment, there's a real grief process. There is a sense of loss, and it's something you wouldn't normally associate, but it is something that really underpins the experience of infertility. Trauma is another thing. So depending on how your experience has been, what's gone not so well, whether there's been a negative impact, that can really create a trauma response, and people will carry that and be impacted. Feelings of shame, I mentioned earlier, so people, where it's still taboo and a bit of a stigma, people might not want to share and really carry that sense of shame. Blame, so depending on it's been something identified with the woman or the male, you might feel like you're to blame, and that is a big thing to carry, and really can impact your mental health, your sense of self-worth, confidence, and those sorts of things. When hearing about announcements, be it baby shower or gender reveals, things like that will really have an impact. And it's not that you're not happy for that person, it's more so you're sad for yourself in terms of what you've been trying to achieve and it hasn't happened yet. And it can and with that you can feel guilty that you don't feel that you feel sadness, but it is very much about the personal experience and the person who's on the journey feeling feeling that sadness and lack of control. Just to expand a bit more about the trauma that can be involved. So this is a really interesting and useful quote from sort of the New York Times, is people affected by infertility must adjust to a major shift in life expectations while being exposed to constant reminders of their condition through questions from family members, medical treatments, or interactions with pregnant women. So a vision that they might have had growing up that, I'm going to have my family, that completely changes when you're given a diagnosis or told it's not going to happen. And then everyday life, there are constant reminders, and it can happen at any time, whether you're out shopping or whether you're hearing an announcement, so it can impact people differently. So it is a trauma, and anxiety and depression and grief play a big part in how it impacts psychologically, but there's much more to experience defined by the individual. So depending on the pathway they've been to get to that point of even embarking on treatment, what people have said, what they've experienced, how it's impacted them and their self-beliefs, that can really impact and create sort of a lot of trauma. Just also want to touch on men and infertility. So a lot of the time, men might fade into the background because it's the woman that gets focused on and because it's kind of happening to her body, so to speak. But again, some research done by Fertility Network, some really interesting findings where men felt excluded and marginalized through treatment because of lack of sensitivity from healthcare professionals. So what can happen, they could purely focus on the female and not kind of pay attention to the male and what they might be going through. And men who have fertility issues find it distressing, isolating, can impact their self-identity and lead to things like stress, depression, anxiety, and low self-esteem. They find it emasculating, and the treatment's one-sided, and the men cannot end up having that emotional support. It impacts all aspects of life, so work, relationships, and there is a lot of stigma and taboo, not just for women but also for men, where it's considered, you might have some banter, but it actually can really have a negative impact on a man going through the journey. Some things about what not to say to someone going through it. When you're having a baby, that's the worst question you could ask anyone. It's just that question. It's the dreaded question, which, why do we need to even ask that question? So that would kind of be my challenge, is to avoid even asking that question to anyone, regardless of how long they've been married, what their age, or anything like that. And some other things which are not very helpful: just relax and it will happen. You don't know what's been going on for them to get to the point where they are trying, and saying relax is just not helpful. Just adopt. That's such a throwaway comment to say that to someone. It's not that easy, because they've had all this build up, all these dreams, all these visions, and to just go from that to that is not that straightforward. Things like, oh, it's your turn to have a baby now, if there's been babies in the family. Oh, I know someone who tried XYZ and got pregnant. That's not very helpful, because everyone's so individual. I was about to start IVF and just fell pregnant. Again, not very useful for someone who's still on that journey. Don't think about it and it will happen. Why don't you go on holiday? A bit like the just relax and it will happen. That's not helpful, because people are doing so much in the background and it doesn't really land well. When you're thinking about having a supportive conversation with someone on the journey, listen. Don't make assumptions about what you think that they need or think that they might want. Empathy versus sympathy. Imagine what it's like to be in their shoes and experience it and really empathize. They don't want pity. Ask them what they need. So avoid going into solution mode. Ask them what it is that will really help them at that point in time. Don't minimize the experience. So don't say, oh, at least, you're not going through this, or at least you have a nice house, a good job. That is not helpful. Do not share stories of someone else's experience, a bit like what I just shared. So don't say, oh, they tried this and it worked, they went to this person. They don't necessarily want that. Create a safe space with no judgment. So I think that's really important, to create those relationships and foundations where people feel like they can come and talk to you if they feel safe and there is no judgment. If appropriate, suggest getting professional support. So if you feel like they are struggling and they could benefit, it's something you can suggest lightly, just to make sure that they're taken care of, because even though you're going through it physically, there is the mental aspect as well that they might need support with. How can workplaces support? So offering flexibility. So that could be time off, reasonable adjustments, changing kind of working pattern to support someone going through treatment, whatever that treatment journey looks like. Having a policy, so that can really help managers and also employees to know where they stand in terms of what support is out there and what they can access. Offer support and guidance, especially around mental health. So that could be an EAP or anything else that is available. Acknowledge the diverse group. So going back to where I spoke about the unique journey. So people are coming from it from different angles in terms of what their experience is. So acknowledging that there are different pathways. Training and awareness for both managers and staff. So that's just to make sure that people are aware of how to approach the topic, and also if you're a manager, how you could be supporting someone to go through that journey. Ongoing commitment and support. So not just a one-off session where you're bringing in someone to talk about it. You keep the conversation alive. You set up, is it maybe support groups, employee resource groups, so just to keep that conversation going. Financial support. Now, this is a difficult one. Are there ways that you can offer financial support, because IVF is so expensive self-funding, but obviously that's very individual, and organisations would need to think about that. Think about your culture and your environment. Is it a supportive environment? Is it quite safe to have these conversations? Think about how baby announcements can be made, just to make sure that you are thinking about others. And, you know, if you are going to do baby announcements, how might that be done? So it could be that, you know, you have that sort of sensitivity, and think about how to have that messaging. So I've talked through kind of, you know, how it can impact, how you can support, but what I'm going to move on to now is a bit around my story. So as I mentioned at the start, I've been on a 10-year journey, so 10-year plus, in trying to achieve what is a vision that I had as a child, which is being a mother. So these are just some images I've taken through my rounds of IVF. So, you know, the amount of injections, you know, being at a restaurant on my birthday, I remember on my second round, injecting, again, the kind of progress as I was going through IVF. And all those pregnancy tests, and that's only a snapshot of kind of what I was using and testing. So at the start of my journey, so when my husband and I got married, it was always a case of, okay, yeah, we're going to have that child before we're 30 and then continue to complete our family. But sadly, that wasn't to happen. So going into our 30s, we started on that actual journey, and we did the sort of natural approach, and nothing was quite happening. So went for some tests and it was all fine. But then going forward, I was having some symptoms. So I went on to have investigations, and it was discovered that I had stage 4 endometriosis. So it was quite severe, and I had to have a couple of operations. And at that point was told I was a great candidate for IVF. So I was put on the NHS wait list for the area where I was living. 6 months went by, nothing happened. Discovered that I actually needed another operation, and at that point was called in for my first round of IVF. And so I had the operation, went in for IVF, and I think there was still a sense of process in terms of how I was accepting and taking on IVF, and it wasn't quite what I wanted and not how I envisioned it to be, but continued. And it was a disastrous experience. It wasn't successful, no eggs were retrieved, and then it went for a period of kind of grieving. My husband and I said to each other, it feels really strange, it feels like someone's died. And, you know, in kind of looking into it, it found out that grief does form part of this process. So I went on to have sort of therapy, helped me with my sort of mental health, and I was in a really good place. Went through to have another round of IVF, discovered I need another operation, so I went through that. And then the second round of IVF was a great experience. It was very positive. We had 2 embryos transferred, and it was in a really good place. But unfortunately, just taking it back, 2-week wait was really stressful, and did the pregnancy test, and it was positive. Elated, but we were both kind of conscious that we're not going to get too happy, and a few days later things started to go wrong. So it seemed like it had failed, but what had transpired was it actually turned into an ectopic pregnancy. So I was being monitored, but then I got to a point where it became dangerous. Went in to have a checkup and was told actually we're operating today. So I had to go in and have an emergency operation because it was on the verge of rupturing, which could have resulted in losing my life. So went through that process, very traumatic, and my mental health started to really deteriorate. And it was, you know, I was still continuing my therapy, but that wasn't helping. And I was adamant to do another round of IVF, which was really detrimental to my mental health because my anxiety was absolutely through the roof. But continued, wasn't successful, and then took a break from having any kind of treatment because it literally took over life. How we plan our holidays, where we go on holiday, work, and it was just taking over life. So we just decided to park it. But what happened is over the coming year, my mental health deteriorated even further to the point where then I was admitted into a psychiatric hospital and diagnosed with PTSD. And that had been sort of activated after the ectopic, and I hadn't realised. So I was in and out of care for about a year, had various treatment, medication, just to support me on my recovery journey. And it was a long path. And at the start of it, all I kept saying was, when I'm going to be better so I can go and do another round of IVF. And that was, looking back, was the wrong thing to be thinking about. But it was all my focus was over time that did kind of go away. So I focused on myself for a few years, and just of getting better, being in recovery. And during the pandemic, my husband and I, we did start looking into adoption, but then that triggered me to think, well, actually, I want to try one last time. And then eventually last year, after some sort of setbacks, we tried and it was unsuccessful. So, and going on that journey, as you can imagine, there is a lot of pain, a lot of heartache. I felt shame for such a long time that it's my fault. I'm holding my husband back while we haven't had a child. And then the grief, going through that cycle. And it's not easy. It's difficult. And it's hard for people to imagine the path that you might be taking. So that's why when you're asking those questions of, okay, so when you're having a baby, you don't know what that person is going through behind the scenes, treatment, trauma, whatever that might be. So it's just about being mindful of anyone on the journey could be going through a number of things, number of challenges, and how it can affect you mentally. There's a lot of trauma involved because, even going through IVF can result in things like conditions where your ovaries are overstimulated, and that is also dangerous. So, all sorts of things can impact your mental health, but it's a lot around the grief. That for me, that's always been an ongoing sort of theme underpinning the whole experience. So I'm at a point where, I don't know which way my story ends, but in my journey, for the last sort of 7 years, I have been supporting others. I run a support group through Fertility Network for South Asian women. And there's a lot out there in terms of support. Just by going on Fertility Network, you'll see there's different support groups, helpline, resources. I think it's always important to understand what's kind of the experience. But from a work perspective, that's where the flexibility, understanding, compassion, and line manager support is going to be really important to support anyone going through that journey. So kind of that's my story, and hope that's been helpful. There's a lot in there, and there's a lot more that I could have spoken about, but I think it's kind of given you some of the key themes of what that experience can look like and how you can support. So being, how you approach someone. Sometimes not saying nothing, the fear of saying something wrong can be harder. So it's just approaching with compassion and just being a listening ear, lending that support and kind of being that ally. So Thrive are here to support around mental health, and there is another webinar next month, which is all about a fascinating insight into ADHD and time management with Rich Berryman. If you'd like to reach out to me, absolutely happy for anyone to reach out if you want to have a conversation, bring it into the workplace. You've got my contact email and website and the QR code if you want to use that to access the website. And hope it's been useful in your own learning, and just opening up for any questions.
Thank you so much for that. So much to think about what you've just said. And as somebody who, I can see now how fortunate I was to fall pregnant so easily. You've really opened like my mind. And thank you so much for that, because I think sometimes it can be really easy to forget just what others go through. And I'm sure I'm not the only one feeling this. So if anybody does have any questions, please do. So no questions from Jenny, but thank you so much for sharing your journey.
And equally happy for anyone to send questions directly to me if you don't want to put it in the chat. But yeah, no, thank you everyone for listening.
Yeah, I think you're getting lots of nice messages in the chat there. I think thank you so much. It felt quite humbling to hear your story and just to see the strength that you've gained, and how great that you are now able to support other individuals through this journey.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I think the more we talk about it, the more we open up the space for others to talk about it and share their own journey. Because as I mentioned about the isolation, it can feel really isolating when you don't have anyone to talk to and you feel like you're in it alone.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time today. It's been super, super interesting. And thank you all for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day. And we will see you next month for Richard's webinar. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.